Today's video is going to focus on the period between the 10th of November 1386 and the 10th of November 1387. Between these years, the Continual Council, or sometimes known as the Lords Appellant, ruled England. So firstly, we need to consider how did they rule the country. Secondly, what did Richard do after the judgments of the Wonderful Parliament? How did he continue the governance of the country with this Continual Council? And finally, and ultimately, how did the two sides clash? So a word that comes up an awful lot when reading about this time period is the appellants, or appellancy. Now appellants are a group of individuals that challenge or appeal against something considered to be inappropriate. In the context of 1386 and 1387, what we're talking about is those members of the nobility that were against Richard's group of favourites. Now, with the absence of John of Gaunt, who was off fighting in Castile, this mainly included four of the most senior noblemen of the country. Thomas Woodstock, who was now Duke of Gloucester, Edmund Langley, who was Duke of York, both of which were Richard's uncles, Richard Fitzalan, who was the Earl of Arundel, and Thomas Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick. Now, the previous four had been on the political scene for a number of years, but there were also two new and young faces. The first was Thomas Mowbray, who was Earl of Nottingham. He had initially been one of Richard's favourites, but was renowned and is renowned as being a rather slippery character. The second was John of Gaunt's son, Henry Bolingbroke, who was Earl of Derby. Later, Henry would actually become Henry IV, King of England. Now, it was these appellants that essentially ruled the country between the 10th of November 1386 and the 10th of November 1387. What was more notable was the fact that a number of key nobility that were involved in the running of the country prior to this were excluded. The first being Michael de la Pole, who had already been impeached in the Wonderful Parliament. The second, Robert de Vere, Marquess of Dublin. Chief Justice Robert Tressilian, Nicholas Brembre, Lord Mayor of London, Alexander Neville, Archbishop of York, and Sir Simon Burley. These were the opponents of the appellants and were Richard's favourites. So what did the appellants do? How did they deal with the problems of Richard's governments over the past couple of years, and how did they deal with Richard's favourites? Now, if you remember, the Continual Council, or the Lords Appellant, were given power so that they could control the country and particularly the finances of the country. So between the 10th of November 1386 and the 10th of November 1387, a number of financial reforms took place. The appellants set about their main objective, and this was to cut the expenditure of the king and clear the debts of the country. The council sent out commissioners to various different parts of the country to see if they could be run more effectively. And nobody was safe from the council's austerity measures. The King's Wardrobe, which was the private spending office, was reduced in terms of its expenditure from £17,000 to £12,000 in this year, an incredible amount. England in 1386 and 1387 was run with the same efficiency that we would characterise Germany to be run today. So the council are effective in their first main aim, to cut the expenditure of the King's wardrobe and the country as a whole. But what of the King's favourites? Well, Burley was questioned regarding the lands that he had inherited and that were given to him by Richard, and pressure was put on Burley to surrender the lands. Likewise, de Vere was accused of not running his lands effectively and for harassing other lords in the area. He was actually forced to pay 1,000 marks in compensation, which was an incredible amount at the time. So they've cut expenditure, they've managed to harass and humiliate Richard's favourites. How did they actually deal with other problems that were present at the time? Well, the only real problem that the council had to face in this year was a potential war against the French and the Flemish, who were the French allies. Arundel secured a victory against the French and the Flemish in a naval battle in March 1387. They managed to steal a number of ships from Flanders, and as a result the price of wine dropped massively in 1387, leading to the majority of people in London getting drunk on victory. So the picture doesn't look good for Richard. So what's he doing in all of this time? Well, he is in communication with the council. They are regularly making correspondence with one another and informing each other of their goings-on. And they have to have these lines of correspondence, because from February 1387, Richard had packed his bags and left London. He decided that he would tour around the Midlands and the north of England and see the estates to which he had governed. This period of 10 months where the king is absent from London and absent from Westminster and absent from governance as a whole is known as the King's Gyration. So why did he do it? Did he just fancy a holiday for 10 months? No, the answer is clear. Richard was trying to gather support against the appellants. He spent a considerable amount of time in North Wales and Cheshire to try and create a new power base. The reason why he perhaps chose North Wales and Cheshire were that they were only a short way away from Ireland, which is where Robert de Vere had inherited these new titles of becoming Marquess of Dublin. And obviously Richard still keeps up this relationship with de Vere. De Vere actually goes through a divorce during this year, and Richard helps this actually happen. Divorces in the 14th century are pretty much unheard of. And it's even more damaging to the reputation of Richard that he is associated with somebody who is a divorcee. De Vere divorces his respectable wife in favour of Anne of Bohemia's handmaiden. And under the advice of Robert Tresilian, the Chief Justice and one of Richard's main favourites, Richard went to a council of judges to discuss the legality of this new continual council. Richard tried to see if there was anything that they could do or anything that they could find to prove that this council was illegal. The judges were reluctant to make a decision, so Richard had to force the issue. Richard persuaded the judges to conclude that the council members were traitors and that they had encroached on royal prerogative. Essentially, they had taken away illegally Richard's power. So on the 10th of November 1387, Richard returned to London in a joyous procession. The people of London seemed almost pleased to see him. The appellants, on the other hand, were incredibly wary. They had heard about this meeting with the judges and decided that on this day that they would make a preemptive strike against Richard and against his favourites. They ordered that the 5 most senior noblemen attached to Richard, including de Vere, should be arrested, and issued warrants of their arrest. A week later, they met with Richard, and Richard and the appellants discussed these arrest warrants. It was agreed over a drink that the 5 would be arrested and tried at the next Parliament, which was set for February 1388. Richard and the appellants made the decision and then retired for supper with a glass of wine. But for Richard, this was all a charade. He had made contact with de Vere through messengers and had ordered de Vere to march from Cheshire, this new base that Richard had tried to set up, towards London, to remove the appellants and to secure the power once again for Richard. But of course the appellants knew of this. They had their own correspondence and their own espionage teams. And it was decided that Thomas Mowbray and Henry Bolingbroke should head de Vere off. Before they could arrest him, they managed to encircle him on the border between Oxfordshire and Berkshire at a place called Radcott Bridge. De Vere's forces were trapped, and on the bridge de Vere had to make the decision as to whether he should stay and fight on behalf of Richard or whether he should flee. Now, we already know what kind of person de Vere is, and of course he decided to flee. He managed to get on a boat and unbelievably escaped out of the clutches of Henry Bolingbroke and Thomas Mowbray. What's more unbelievable is actually that he managed to meet up with Richard at Queenborough Castle, and they agreed at that moment that for de Vere's safety and for the benefit of the realm, that de Vere should flee into exile and go to France. This was the last time that the two would ever see each other. So Richard has been completely humiliated. His attempts to try and remove the appellants from rule has ended sourly and has actually given more strength to the appellants' argument. Richard hides in the Tower of London, the place 10 years earlier he had started his procession to become king. The Lords Appellant, Thomas Mowbray, Henry Bolingbroke, the Earl of Warwick, the Duke of Gloucester, the Duke of York, marched towards Richard to find him and decide what they should do. So in class we're going to look at the decisions that the appellants had to make once they met up with Richard at the Tower of London. But really the question that emanates from the gyration period of 1386 to 1387 is whether or not Richard could have avoided this conclusion, and was he really the person that is responsible for his downfall.